This is TWiT.
SolarWinds attack details continue to emerge. As we know, digital attack forensics takes time. And most of it requires very careful reverse engineering of code, which has been carefully designed to thwart exactly that kind of analysis. So it's not just like, random script kiddie code that's like, Python source where you just look at it and go, oh, this is what it does. This, especially in the case of the SolarWinds threat actors, we know, and we're going to know a lot more in a minute about how incredibly good they were at their craft. So they designed their stuff to make it very difficult to figure out what it was doing. So we would expect to be learning more about this largest known attack in history over time. And indeed, last Wednesday, the 20th, in a joint posting by the Microsoft 365 Defender Research Team, their Threat Intelligence Center, that's the MSTIC that we often talk about, and the Microsoft Cyber Defense Operations Center, that's a new one, the CDOC, we learned a great deal more. For what it's worth, it's only more worrisome. Microsoft's joint disclosure was titled Deep Dive into the Solorigate Second Stage Activation, from sunburst to teardrop to raindrop. And Microsoft begins their quite lengthy disclosure with a summary of what everyone knows, and then, but quickly adds some new detail, which is interesting. They said, more than a month into the discovery of Solorigate, investigations continue to unearth new details that prove it is one of the most sophisticated and protracted intrusion attempts of the decade. Our continued analysis of threat data shows that the attackers behind Solorigate are skilled campaign operators who carefully planned and executed the attack, remaining elusive while maintaining persistence. These attackers appear to be knowledgeable about operations security and performing malicious activity with minimal footprint. In this blog, we'll share new information to help better understand how the attack transpired. Our goal is to continue empowering the Defender community by helping to increase their ability to hunt for the earliest artifacts of compromise and protect their networks from this threat. They said, we've published our in-depth analysis of the Solorigate backdoor malware, also referred to as Sunburst by FireEye. The compromised DLL that was deployed on networks as part of SolarWinds products that allowed attackers to gain backdoor access to affected devices. We've also detailed the hands-on keyboard techniques that attackers employed on compromised endpoints using a powerful second-stage payload, one of several custom Cobalt Strike loaders, including the loader dubbed Teardrop by FireEye and a variant named Raindrop by Symantec. One missing link in the complex Solorigate attack chain is the handover from the Solorigate DLL backdoor to the Cobalt Strike loader. Our investigations show that the attackers went out of their way to ensure that these two components are separated as much as possible to evade detection. This blog provides details about this handover based on a limited number of cases where this process has been observed to occur. To uncover these cases, we use the powerful cross-domain optics of Microsoft 365 Defender to gain visibility across the entire attack chain in one complete and consolidated view. We'll also share our deep dive into additional hands-on keyboard techniques that the attackers used during initial reconnaissance data collection and exfiltration, which complement the broader TTPs from similar investigative blogs such as those from FireEye and Velocity. And so I'm going to skip over a lot of that nitty-gritty because it's interesting for anyone who's interested, and I've got the link in the show notes. But here's the cool bit that is understandable. They said, an attack timeline that SolarWinds disclosed in a recent blog showed that a fully functional Solorigate DLL backdoor was compiled at the end of February 2020. Okay, so early in 2020, last year, and distributed to systems sometime in late March. The same blog also said that the attackers, and this I did not know, removed the Solorigate backdoor code from SolarWinds build environment in June of 2020. They said, considering this timeline and the fact that the Solorigate backdoor was designed to stay dormant for at least 2 weeks, we approximate that the attackers spent a month or so in selecting victims and preparing unique Cobalt Strike implants, as well as command and control infrastructure. This approximation means that real hands-on keyboard activity most likely started as early as May. The removal of the backdoor generation function and the compromised code from SolarWinds binaries in June could indicate that by this time, the attackers had reached a sufficient number of interesting targets, and their objectives shifted from deployment and activation of the backdoor, so-called stage 1, to being operational on selected victim networks, continuing the attack with hands-on keyboard activity using the Cobalt Strike implants. So as I said, again, that was news to me. I assumed that the SolarWinds build and update delivery system had remained infected, but that's not the case. As Microsoft observed, it didn't need to keep offering infected DLLs once all of the major targets had already updated and received the infection. Essentially, they'd already gotten out over the course of, 6 months to, March, April, May, June. So maybe 4 months. And then again, in observing the highest level of care, they removed the source of the infection so that the SolarWinds DLL would then be clean, and further updates would remove it from the systems that had previously received it and had already moved from stage 1 into stage 2. So, an act of deliberately eliminating the tracks of how this all happened. So one of the coolest things Microsoft found was the way the original SolarWinds infection created this arm's length execution path in such a way that the original infection stood a maximum chance of remaining undetected, even if its downstream consequences were detected. Remember that the moment it was discovered, that a signed SolarWinds DLL was the root source of the infection, that would have brought down the entire operation. And as we know, that is what eventually happened at FireEye, but the obfuscation was successful for a very long time. So here's how Microsoft explains what they found. They said, we spent countless hours investigating Microsoft Defender telemetry and other signals from potential patient zero machines running the backdoored version of SolarWinds DLL. Most of these machines communicated with the initial randomly generated DNS domain. Remember that it was blah, blah, blah avsvmcloud.com. They said, but without significant activity. However, we saw limited cases in May and June where the initial DNS network communication was closely followed by network activity on port 443, HTTPS, to other legitimate-looking domains. On these handful of machines, we performed deep inspection of telemetry. We know that the Solorigate backdoor only activates for certain victim profiles. And when this happens, the executing process, usually SolarWinds.businesslayerhost.exe, creates two files on the victim disk. A VB script, typically named after existing services or folders to blend into legitimate activities on the machine, and a second stage DLL implant, which is a custom Cobalt Strike loader, typically compiled uniquely per machine and written into a legitimate-looking subfolder underneath C:\Windows. So in other words, they on a per infection target, they created a VB script that was uniquely named to be like to fit in to what was going on that particular machine, and custom wrote and compiled a unique, they called it the Cobalt Strike loader, again, for that machine. So one of the things this did was it meant you could not compare infected systems. You wouldn't find any obvious indications of compromise that were the same because they were essentially doing per target customization. Microsoft said at this point, the attackers are ready to activate the Cobalt Strike implant. However, the attackers apparently deem the powerful SolarWinds backdoor too valuable to lose in case of discovery. So they tried to separate the Cobalt Strike loader's execution from the SolarWinds process as much as possible. Their hope is that even if they lose the Cobalt Strike implant due to discovery and detection, the compromised SolarWinds binary and the supply chain attack that preceded it will not be exposed. The attackers achieved this by having the SolarWinds process create an image file execution options, that's IFEO, debugger registry value for the process DLL host.exe. And I'll just insert an aside here. This is a known and official way of causing Windows to attach a debugger to a process at startup. If you want to put a given Windows process under debugging, sometimes it's not enough to attach the debugger after the process is already initialized. You need, there may be initialization code that is where the problem is. So you need Windows to start the debugging like from the moment the process goes into RAM. The way you do that is by using one of this image file execution options, debugger registry values, which causes Windows to automatically load something into that process's space. This, of course, can also be used for malicious purposes. So the SolarWinds process first created one of these entries, which would for the DLL host.exe. That execution process triggers a launch of wscript.exe, which is configured to run that VB script file, which has been dropped earlier and had been waiting. The VB script, in turn, runs the run DLL32.exe, which activates the Cobalt Strike DLL using a clean parent-child process tree, which is completely disconnected from the SolarWinds process. So essentially, by using this sanctioned Windows hook in the registry to cause the DLL host to invoke wscript.exe, there was a complete separation of these two events, meaning that anybody who did discover the Cobalt Strike DLL and the way it got executed would only see that it was tied to this debugging. Oh, and once it runs, it removes the IFEO value from the registry to also clean that up. So you can't even figure out how this thing got started if you look at it after it's running. So anyway, their full posting, as I mentioned, is super long and wonderfully detailed for anyone wanting to really get down into the nitty-gritty. But in the section Additional Attacker Tactics, Anti-Forensic Behavior, and Operational Security, Microsoft nicely summarizes some more detail to give us a more complete sense for the frightening skill and tradecraft that the designers of this attack deployed. They said, as mentioned, the attackers behind Solorigate are skillful and methodic operators who follow operations security best practices to minimize traces, stay under the radar, and avoid detection. During our in-depth analysis of the attacker's tactics, techniques, and procedures, TTPs, seen through the lens of Microsoft 365 Defender's telemetry, we observed a few techniques that are worth disclosing to help other defenders better respond to this incident and use hunting tools like Microsoft 365 Defender, advanced hunting, or Azure Sentinel queries to search for potential traces of past activity. Some examples of why these attackers stand out for their operational OPSEC methodology and anti-forensic behavior are listed below, and they have 6 or 5. First, methodic avoidance of shared indicators for each compromised host. As discussed in the previous section, each Cobalt Strike DLL implant was prepared to be unique per machine and avoided at any cost overlap and reuse of folder name, file name, export function names, those are internal to the DLL, command and control domain and IP, HTTP requests, timestamp, file metadata, config, and child processes launched. They said this extreme level of variance was also applied to non-executable entities, such as WMI persistence filter name, WMI filter query, passwords used for 7-zip archives, and names of output log files. I mean, so what we're looking at is an absolute lack of laziness. I mean, true discipline for every single entity that they infected. They said applying this level of permutations for each individual compromised machine is an incredible effort, normally not seen with other adversaries, and done to prevent full identification of all compromised assets inside a network or effective sharing of threat intel between victims. Second, camouflage and blending into the environment. Tools and binaries used by the attackers, for example, AD find, Active Directory find, legit tool, were always renamed and placed in folders that mimicked existing programs and files already present on a machine. This blending was not just used for files, but for other elements. For example, WMI persistent filters were created with names and queries matching other scripts present in affected organizations. This is just stunning. Third, before running intensive and continued hands-on keyboard activity, the attackers took care of disabling event logging using audit policy and re-enabling it afterward. In a similar way, before running noisy network enumeration activities, such as repeated NS lookup and LDAP queries, the attackers carefully prepared special firewall rules to minimize outgoing packets for certain protocols. The firewall rules were also methodically removed after the network reconnaissance was completed. I hope this is terrifying everybody. This is just, it's terrifying me. Lateral movement activities were never executed without preparation. To increase the likelihood that their activities remain undetected, the attackers first enumerated remote processes and services running on the target host and decided to move laterally only after disabling certain security services. And finally, they said, we believe that the attackers used time stomping to change timestamps of artifacts and also leveraged professional wiping procedures and tools to complicate finding and recovering of DLL implants from affected environments. So
I like time stomping. I'm going to keep that in my back pocket there.
Time stomping, yes. Stepping back to take stock in all that we have learned, any sane InfoSec technologist would be right to be seriously worried. My feeling is that as damaging as these attacks were individually and on their own, it's almost more worrisome it's almost more worrisome outcome for the attackers is for us to have obtained this much greater appreciation for their skill and their dedication to detail. It has without question sobered up and heightened the level of attention that the defender industry now realizes it needs to deploy. And remember, none of us should forget for a moment that were it not for the fact that they targeted FireEye and that their presence eventually tripped some monitoring alarms that the attackers were unaware of, because as we've just seen, if they knew about it, they would have either aborted or they would have disabled those monitoring alarms. Something tripped them up. If that had not happened, this would all still be ongoing right now.